bureaucracy is so huge that it buffers almost anything that you can do. I mean, the people that I found in the environmental community, and there's only been a few, and this may sound weird, were in your face assholes. I mean, they would come into agencies and make managers uncomfortable. And in doing, I mean, that is the only way I've seen any any kind of even consideration of environmental effect.
Welcome, Wild Ones. This is Josh Schlossberg, host of the Green Root Podcast, the official podcast of Eco Integrity Alliance, where we're on a quest to uncover the roots of the ecological crisis. For this episode, I'd like to welcome our guest, Lyle Lewis. Lyle is a former Endangered Species Branch Chief with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and a writer focused on extinction, evolutionary history, and the hidden dynamics of landscape ecology. Welcome to the Green Root Podcast, Lyle.
Thanks for having me, Josh.
So we met on Substack, which for folks who don't know is a really great platform. I call it social media for the literate. And you have a great Substack there, which I really appreciate, on ecology and environmental issues. And I believe that you had commented on a post that I made from our podcast where I had talked about, is the concept of conservation passé? And my framing is thus, and we disagreed a little bit, and it was an enjoyable exchange. And I said, hey, you should come on the podcast and we can have a friendly little debate and see where things go. So that's how we're going to start things off. So let me reframe or frame again my view that I started to have more recently. So obviously the concept of conservation, protecting lands, I'm not going to be able to protect everything in the world. That has been a valuable contributor to a lot of ecological protections over time. And I guess what I have been noticing is that despite all of the past victories, all of the great efforts by so many folks, I believe the vast majority of people in the conservation movement are well-meaning, good faith. We're facing some of the most difficult environmental situation that we ever have. Some of our policy is the worst that we've ever seen, not just from Republicans, but from Democrats. And we have groups that call themselves conservation groups, which are not just saying, hey, we're going to protect this and this is going to have to go by the wayside. A lot of them are actively advocating for an increase in extraction, so largely logging and grazing, ranching on public lands. So in my mind, it's both not been effective enough, and at the same time, there is no way to really beat the entities that call themselves, these bigger entities that call themselves conservation groups, as they advocate for, one could say, degradation, destruction. And so what all that needs to happen is elected officials, government agencies, or media outlets can just find one of these entities and just say, look, the conservation community supports it. And the rest of us will be like, excuse us, we don't quite agree with that. They're like, too late. The big dogs in the room, the real conservationists support all of this logging. So get out of here. So anyway, that was my general framing, and I'd love to hear any perspective you have on any of that.
Well, I don't think our view of conservation organizations or conservation in general is all that different. And you're right about conservation groups in that they have a tendency to take on a life of their own. And when they're first started, they're very idealistic. They're hard charging usually. They have all of the best intentions, but then they are over time, they're gradually corrupted by the very thing that they were designed to prevent, and that's monetary interests. Because, I mean, one of the phrases people use in environmental organizations is, there's individuals that they call rainmakers. They they go out and get funding in order to make their organization run. And at, at some point in time, they gradually morph from an environmental organization into a business and basically have a business model. And in order to get the funding to do that, they often and almost always become beholden to the very industries that they were trying to prevent to begin the whole process. And it's almost like there's an evolution with a lot of conservation organizations where that thing exactly happens. And what I found in my career is the conservation organizations that are most effective are usually the ones that are really small, that don't, usually there's one or two individuals that are really, they they're not making any money. They're basically living hand to mouth. They're hard charging. And they don't bow down to the monetary interests that they're trying to fight. And so those so there are effective environmental organizations out there, but oftentimes they're not the over time, the bigger the organization, the more they have a tendency to basically become a business in and of themselves, and they end up compromising their original values.
Yeah. Well, I don't disagree with any of that. I guess my take would be, okay, so we agree that these larger entities are at the best, let's just say, diluting what is originally the mission of the environmental community. And we could say for financial reasons, maybe they personally actually believe that we need to have more working lands, whatever it is, like the Nature Conservancy. It has a $1.8 billion budget. I don't really even consider them a conservation group anymore. I consider them a working lands entity, which, maybe that perspective should be out there, that lands can be extracted and maybe with a slightly lighter touch. I just don't see that as conservation. But let me give you an example and see what you think about this. So here in Colorado, where I focus a lot, although not exclusively, and Eco Integrity Alliance focuses across the US, although we are mostly focused in 8 Western states where we have our state advocates. But there is a ballot measure that is unfortunately being propagated that would increase the amount of taxpayer funding that would go to logging projects under the guise of wildfire. People can debate the details of that. For sure, probably most of it would go to projects that are really indistinguishable from industrial scale logging. It's clear cutting, mature and old growth tree removal, cutting in endangered species habitat, roadless areas. It is logging by the definition of the term, whatever the excuse is. So that is out there as an initiative. There are 2 conservation groups here locally, and I'm debating whether to name them because we have a sign-on letter that about 20 other grassroots, and not just grassroots, some of the larger organizations signed on to, asking them to please answer some questions, and they've ignored us thus far, but I'm going to give them a week. So I'm not going to mention them right now, even though I have in the past. But anyway, these two larger organizations, and of course the Nature Conservancy, which they're lost to us. They're promoting this, and so there is a media outlet here in Colorado that I will name called the Colorado Sun that has become really just anti-environmental propaganda. They're probably the worst they're the worst media outlet I've ever seen reporting on environmental stuff because they do intentionally promote one-sided information, defamatory information against scientists, conservationists, whatever. But they were able to run an article saying this ballot measure is supported by conservationists. And technically, that's not 100% false. So our concern is if these entities that are promoting extraction, not just doing weak advocacy, not just standing aside when they should be fighting the good fight, they're advocating for more extraction, for more funding for that. They call themselves conservationists. Everyone can then say conservationists support this. Wouldn't it make sense for the rest of us who are not a fan of expanding extraction, let's say on public lands, to call ourselves something different just so we can distinguish ourselves? So does that argument make any sense?
That's a huge can of worms, just because, you know, conservationists, sustainability, green, there's all kinds of terms in conservation that can be compromised in a wide variety of ways. And so labeling, you know, I just don't pay attention to the labels as much as the actions. And so, uh, you know, if they're exploiting natural resources, environmental resources in ways that undermine the ability of ecosystems to operate effectively, then they're not conservationists, no matter what they call themselves. And so you just have to accept that and move on. But the trouble is, it's groups like that that control the media because they have the power. They have, they're beholden to the, you know, it just circles back to the, what our initial conversation was, is when they control the media and they control the money, there isn't much we can do. And so conservation is really about friction, creating as much friction as we possibly can in the face of an ever growing population on the planet. And a lot of the environmental laws were created, you know, back in the early 70s. And the people that created those laws, I mean, it was a confluence of events that allowed those laws to come into being, is, you know, like the Endangered Species Act. It was a time when all of a sudden America was being embarrassed because their national symbol, the bald eagle, was going extinct. And and so it became a political issue. And there were, you know, a few other things like that that converge to allow, for example, the Endangered Species Act to pass. And there was a number of other fairly key environmental laws in the 70s that passed as a result of that confluence of events. But it was, those laws were never meant to stop progress. The people that created those laws weren't environmentalists. Richard Nixon was the one that, you know, signed the Endangered Species Act into a law. He wasn't an environmentalist. A lot of the people that created national parks and wilderness areas, you know, they weren't environmentalists. At least a lot of the senators and that allowed those laws to come into being, and those same laws would never see the light of day today. But in the 70s, there was still some slack. Ecosystems still had a little room. There were only, you know, about 4 billion people instead of 8 billion people. And so we put increasing amounts of pressure on environmental resources and expects the laws that were designed to, you know, basically uh, instigate a little bit of restraint to still work when the conditions under which they were formed have completely changed. And so, you know, like with the Endangered Species Act, you know, they carve out exemptions all the time for this species and that species. I mean, there's all kinds of ways that people undermine those laws and are continuing to undermine those laws in the name of growth. And, you know, what you're describing in Colorado with that law isn't any different that happened uh, 100 years ago when they carved out Hetch Hetchy Dam in Yosemite Valley. I think there was some kind of flood in in San Francisco that a guy that was a senator at the time and who later became the Secretary of Interior in an administration used as an excuse to build Hetch Hetchy Dam. And there was no uh, cause and effect between what happened in San Francisco and the dam, but rivers and forests and grasslands don't have any say. And so they can be scapegoated by humans that are bound and determined to, uh, foster a productive and growing economy and are growth oriented. And so that same thing happens over and over again. You see the same thing with, I saw it in Idaho when I was working for the Department of Interior in the 80s and 90s when Department of Fish and Game there blamed predators for pheasants, uh, the disappearance of pheasants instead of clean farming. And so they went on this huge predator control gig. You can see the same things happening in Alaska now with predator control for grizzlies and wolves to try to arrest the caribou population declines that where they have nothing to do with it. But we're so we are unable to accept personal responsibility or culpability for what's happening. And so we scapegoats those that have no say in the matter. And whether it's, rivers or predators or ungulates or whoever it is, uh, we're not going to accept any blame for what's happening. And just like I mean, you can see it on a large level with the forest fires and forest health. It's all just greenwashing because 84% of forest fires are started by people, and so it's kind of like blaming banks for bank robberies. I mean, as we've got to tear down all the banks to prevent bank robberies. Well, that's exactly what we're doing with forests. you know, it isn't arsonists or accidents or anything like that that the majority of forest fires are caused by. It's unhealthy forests. And so, with the small percentage of forests that are actually started by natural causes, we're making them worse by our activities, by thinning forests, drying them out, taking out a lot of the large trees that are the most effective buffers against forest fires. We're it's kind of the confluence of all of the things that are making forest work or worse. And there's obviously a lot of environmental groups that have bought into that, and it's myth. But myth is a moneymaker.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the difficult part about this debate is I agree with almost everything you say, so that makes it kind of hard. But the piece about conservation. So I guess, sticking to this one premise of if conservation is we are setting aside this piece and uh, you know as we progress or regress, basically with all the things that you're saying, with all the environmental pressures. And it sort of seems like sometimes we're just splitting that baby over and over again because it seems like a lot of it is sort of like, okay, we'll protect this one, say, wild area, but the industry and agencies can have this other piece. And maybe that made sense when we had hundreds of millions of acres or beyond that, whatever. But at this point in time where we have so little left that is intact and all of it's so precious, I guess in my mind, that concept of conservation is not sufficient to really hold off the wolves, although I don't want to blame the wolves in this case. The wolves don't do anything wrong, You know what I'm saying? So like we keep splitting, keep splitting, keep splitting. But it seems like what you're saying is no, that's bad conservation or not conservation at all, right? That's your take on that.
No, I'm saying resisting in whatever way possible is conservation. And trying to hold on to whatever we've got left for as long as we possibly can. That's conservation. It's friction in a world that doesn't want to see it. And, I lived as a source of friction inside agencies. And a lot of times it was very unpleasant. But, we all can do that in our own way. But you still have to be realistic about, basic ecological principles like competitive displacement. For every new human that's born in the world today, there's all kinds of native plants and animals that will be sacrificed to make that individual happen. And you can't have more and more livestock and people and all these other things without having less and less biodiversity and wild places, and until we reach a critical point. And that critical point is we're gradually simplifying landscapes, and it's be, it's becoming increasingly dangerous in a whole variety of ways. But uh, but it's a process. When you talk about we've set aside these landscapes, well, those landscapes that we set aside had already probably been compromised over thousands of years. I mean, we've started, this mass extinction event started hundreds of thousands, probably millions of years ago. And so it hasn't been, agriculture and then industrialization or any one capitalism. It's this whole series of pressures that we as a species have evolved over time. And, we didn't start out with, intact forests. And, that's one of the things that having spent decades in wilderness areas and backcountry has taught me is, a lot of these areas are already severely compromised and have been probably for thousands of years. And you can, it can be explained both with hydrology, it can be explained with physics, it can be explained with ecology. But the planet has always evolved. I mean, for millions of years, it evolved to slow down thermodynamics and entropy. You know, we megafauna and megaflora were the ways that the planet had evolved to slow down the loss of nutrients on the landscape. And nutrients is just energy and matter. And when you start looking at how systems operated evolutionarily, nutrients stayed on the landscape. I mean, animals utilized landscapes, they died on landscapes. Megafauna transferred nutrients across large areas. And so, but they also did something else. I mean, everything depends on water, at least mammals and trees and everything else. But they slowed the movement of water across landscapes. And with every step in our evolution, we have gradually undermined both physics and water. Instead of nutrients staying on the landscape, what you're describing in Colorado is, with logging, you take nutrients off the landscape. With grazing, we continually take nutrients off the landscape. But also, both of those activities and many of the other activities we do the exact same thing with water. We move water quicker and quicker off the landscape all the time. And instead of holding both nutrients and water on the landscape as the planet evolved to do over millions of years, it's rushing off faster and faster and faster. And life revolves around water. It dictates, what can exist and what can't. The same with nutrients. And the biggest organisms on the landscape evolved to hang on to those two things more than any other. And those are the things that we have been continually compromising. And so, we're way down the the slope of where the planet started, several million years ago as a result of human activities. And so creation still is about honesty, it's about integrity, and it's about friction, trying to hang on to the last witnesses, the tiny fragments that still exist that provide the memory of what the planet once was.
Well, some really great stuff there. And yeah, I want to comment on a few of the things, but I guess, yeah, maybe we'll put our mini fake debate to bed and say that, okay, you've convinced me that those of us who are maybe calling ourselves ecosystem advocates, wildlife advocates, whatever, we're still conservationists. We shouldn't give up the term just because other people are exploiting and diluting it. There's still something about it that I feel like it's been so co-opted that I'm worried about it. But you've kind of convinced me that maybe we shouldn't abandon that terminology. So, because I can think of some really great groups, just a group I'll just mention, Conservation Congress, they're called. They're a very small group. They're one of the folks that you mentioned that is doing grassroots stuff that is really tenacious. They call themselves conservationists. Why should I, decree that they no longer can use that term? So you make some really good points. And yeah, well, unless you want to say anything about that, I did want to ask you a question about something else you said there.
Oh, no, go ahead.
So you mentioned compromised areas. So going along with that premise, what do we do with areas that might be compromised?
Well, I think it still boils down to physics and hydrology. I mean, those are the two things that are kind of the structural support for ecology. And whatever we can do to uh, to hold back soils or to hold back nutrients, to hold back water naturally as much as we can. And the one thing that kind of gets lost in everything is, we've got to do something. I mean, that's the mantra of agencies. And in fact, their whole world is premised on, they've got to produce so many widgets to show Congress that they're worthy of the budget they got. Well, there's no line items in a budget for restraint. And yet, restraint is the one thing, not logging, not grazing, not doing those things is the very best thing we can do. But that isn't within our purview as a species. We we're it's kind of the tyranny of numbers, where we're ruled by these numbers and widgets and progress and all of these things, and to actually think that, what, the best thing we can do is nothing. I mean, it's just not within our wheelhouse. And it's sad because the best thing, most of the time, the best thing we can do is nothing. I mean, there are exceptions, but, uh, you know, uh, I can name a few, but for the most part, nothing works best.
I totally agree. Unfortunately, every time we say that, we're told that we are evil tree huggers who don't know what we're talking about. A lot of the agencies, as you know, will either look at what you want to call compromised areas. A lot of times they'll pretend that they are when they're not. They'll claim, say, these high elevation forests that have several hundred-year fire regimes. They claim that that's been disrupted by fire suppression, even though you look at their own literature and they admit that they haven't. And so then, of course, their answer to a compromised area, whether it's really one or not, is yes, do something. every time it ends up, like you're saying, taking nutrients off the landscape. So taking trees off the landscape, we have to log it more. Yes, we were wrong before when we were doing everything for timber production, but now the answer is timber production. And yeah, it's like, forgive us if we don't believe what you're saying. But one way to maybe reframe the nothing is, some of us are at Eco Integrity Alliance. One of the frames we're using is biodiversity, watershed, climate, refugia. So it's not doing nothing, right? If like you say, the human tendencies, we have to be doing something. Okay, we are doing something. We're protecting it as that by doing nothing. So that's one way that we're looking at it. But yeah, anything you have to say about that? Because I want to talk to you a bit more about the agency stuff, because you have that unique perspective. So definitely want to get there. But any response to what I said? Otherwise, we can go on to the agency stuff.
I guess I'm maybe I missed something. What am I responding
No,
to?
that's okay. I just, in terms of your premise that humans can't do nothing, even though that might be the best bet. So what we're saying is, we're going to frame doing nothing as in doing something, which is putting public lands aside as biodiversity, watershed, climate, refugia. So it's like we're taking this active interest in the land. And so instead of the argument that industry is saying and agencies are saying that you guys just want to do nothing, you just want nature to take over, which is true. We're saying, no, we actually are doing a positive action that is doing something. So it fits in that wheelhouse of, like you said, that human framework of we always have to be doing something. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I actually wrote a Substack article called Willow. It was about a mountain lion, and it was a ranch in Montana that had uh, basically, it was a large acreage within a landscape that was grazed and logged and hunted that did nothing. And it, you know, they purchased the property. It did, from a logging company that had already logged it. So it wasn't old growth and it wasn't a lot of things. But doing nothing allowed what was there to express itself. And that alone resulted in all kinds of positive things happening relative to other places on the landscape. And so doing nothing, it has, even though, most people feel like, conservation is restoration, but, and that's where people um, they can't fathom irreversible. But irreversible is baked into our planet as a result of hundreds of thousands of years of human activity. And so this is where the honesty and integrity part of the whole equation is. This is what we've got. This is what what we've got to work with. And how can we best hang on to what we have for as long as we possibly have? And so, we're basically saying the same thing in a little different way. But, uh, what you're saying is, uh, you know, making something out of doing nothing. If you could frame it that way, good for you. I mean, go for it. But, for the most part, you know, uh, the lighter the hand that we can put on the landscape, the better, with a few exceptions.
Yeah, no, totally agree. And that is what we advocate for at Eco Integrity Alliance and a lot of our allies. Yeah, there are a few exceptions, like maybe we should be ripping up some of the 380,000 miles of roads in the national forest and putting those back to bed. So maybe nature could use a little help in just sort of tearing up those compacted, eroding logging roads, and then nature taking its course. But frankly, if we could just close off some of those, nature would figure it out eventually. But
Yeah.
I believe in giving the agencies busy work to do so they're not doing destruction. So if that becomes their main focus, which is ripping up those roads, and then even having people patrolling, like back in the day of actual rangers patrolling to uh, prevent, fires, right? To prevent human caused fires. Maybe some more that I would love to see them doing that. But I want to talk to you more about the agency stuff because this is a real unique opportunity to talk to somebody who was in the belly of the beast there. So tell us, I mean, but whatever you want about what work you were doing, and yeah, just start there and tell us what you like about that.
Well, it was the best and worst of all worlds. And if you were a true wildlife advocate, because like I told you, no matter what your role, if you're an environmentalist or a conservationist or whatever you want to call yourself, you're creating friction. And the most agencies have um, their role has been to uh, bow down to the political situation that usually defines what they can do and what they can't do. And it still boils down to what we talked about earlier, that the laws that a lot of agencies were designed to implement were were passed at a time when there was so much more slack in ecosystems, when there was 4 billion people and not 8 billion people. And so now they and this was another Substack article I wrote recently about, and you saw it with Stephen Colbert on the CBS, and you know the, all of the lawyers told him what questions he could ask a Democratic lawmaker and which they couldn't. But in agencies, they gradually refine themselves to the point that you can't ask questions. I mean, the questions you ask inside agencies determine whether you are promoted or not. And asking difficult questions about environmental causes is a way to be sentenced to bureaucratic purgatory. And, I've been there, I've done that. And for someone that's an advocate to work inside agencies, you're writing a very fine line all of the time between, you know, making yourself completely uh, unavailable as a result of them, throwing you into purgatory, and trying to, make some kind of effective actions that might help species and wildlands and everything else that an environmental advocate would hold dear. And so it is a very difficult place to be, and most people don't persevere. They they usually succumb to the pressures, and actually those pressures become normalized within the agency to the point that even people that when they graduated and went into the agency with very idealistic expectations, usually you're beat on once or twice and they conform. I mean, it's almost like a way to, uh, after investing a lot of your self in college and your grad program or whatever the case may be, you're not going to. Most people don't want to throw that out the window, and so they conform to the pressures within the agency, and eventually those become normalized, and those very same people move up the agency and start putting pressure on those you know people that are new to the agency that had the same belief system that they did when they first came into the agency. And so the agency kind of selects for itself in ways that promote growth and economic growth. And and there's some things that as humans are so large that we just can't fathom changing, and so they become part of the environmental baseline. And one of them is economic growth. Another is so big, highway systems. I mean, if you've been inside environmental agencies and tried to, get connectivity for wildlife populations across highways. I mean, I was working on that in the 90s, and it, you're almost laughed off because highways are such a big issue, and people don't even consider that, wildlife should be able to move across highways. It's not even a consideration. And yet, highways may be one of the biggest uh, biodiversity constraints on that we currently have on populations right now. And you can see it in Colorado, you can see it everywhere. It's planet wide. And you talked about the Forest Service roads, and that's one other place where connectivity has been sacrificed. But it's a small part of the interstate system, or it's a small subset of a much larger subset of international problem of highways and roads. And I think I did an analysis at one time that just in the United States, the amount of roads and highways is equal to like uh, paving New York and Pennsylvania or something like that. That might not be. This is off the top of my head. I can't. This was a few years ago. I did that analysis, but it's significant. And then you start thinking about moving nutrients and water off the landscape in a hurry. Highways do it better than anything. Roads and highways are one of the main ways of moving water off a landscape in a huge hurry. Cities are another one. Any kind of a paved or roof or anything, water hits it and it's gone. It immediately runs off. We see it all the time, but we accept that as normal. It's not. I mean, you're watching life rush downstream and out into the ocean, and we've accepted that as just part of normal everyday activity. And that in itself is a problem for conservation environmentalists, is accepting what we have now as what it always has been, and that this is the environmental baseline we're working with, and it's not.
That's really fascinating. Those are some great insights. Yeah, I wanted to ask you some specifics about your take on some agency dealings that some of us have had and see what you have to say. Because, yeah, I think that most people who go into these agencies, they are, at least at the beginning, doing things in good faith. And a lot of them are just doing their jobs, and there is compromise involved with some jobs. I do think that the entities themselves become corrupt. I'm sure some of the individuals become corrupt, but I haven't found that's really the case. I just think they're kind of expected to do certain things. And yeah, that's your profession, your livelihood. You have kids, you have family, you have mortgages. These people are not necessarily going to like, yeah, chain themselves to a tree and lose their job, right? They're trying to be sensible and maintain a livelihood. And yeah, I will say the entity you were part of, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, even though I disagree with some of the things, a lot of things that happen there, I've met a lot of the biologists. I mean, a lot of the folks who are part of that really are well-meaning. It's just the entity they're a part of can only do so much. But you were Endangered Species Branch Chief, so I mean that in its title, you were at least you were aware of, you were trying to address a real concern. So yeah, I can't really hold that against agency staffers. So I just wanted to have that preamble before I start attacking agencies. So here in Colorado, this is again just one very specific example, but it's a real life example, and I've seen it replicated elsewhere across the country. It's the same thing that plays out over and over again. I've lived in multiple places. It's just like deja vu. I'm like, didn't I deal with this 11 years ago? Oh, that was in Vermont and a different entity, but the same thing. So here's a perfect example. So right now in Colorado, we have our latest natural wave of the native mountain pine beetle. And there was the previous big wave was over a decade ago, and sure, leading up to it, oh, the sky is falling, every imaginable terrible thing is going to happen. Then the wave passed. Yeah, trees were killed. That's what the beetles do. And then the science that they found afterwards, everyone flocked to Colorado. And we have some of the leading experts on this topic here in Colorado, scientists. And they found that the beetle killed areas, the areas that experienced more beetle kill, not only did not were not more likely to ignite or in wildfire or have higher severity wildfire. They found in many cases it was the opposite, and certainly no correspondence to increase in burning. So that seemed like settled science. And in fact, it is settled science. Unfortunately, what happened was now we have another wave, which is a natural wave. So this is about, yeah, well, I guess the other one peaked at 2010. So maybe that one started 20 early 2000s, whatever. So we're getting another one just in the timing that one can expect. The same exact sky is falling rhetoric. And now this time, there can't be any excuse that they don't know better. So I'm talking about the agencies here in Colorado. They do know better. And they're framing the entire thing as we either log or the entire front range of the Rockies are going to burn. And so it's really been up to a handful of us, just grassroots folks, to be like, excuse me, but we do know this is not accurate. And we have the world's leading scientists on this issue literally in our state, and you can talk to them. But instead, what they did is they put together, so Governor Jared Polis here and the Department of Natural Resources, Colorado Natural Resources, which I call Colorado Department of Natural Resources Extraction because I'm a mean person. But anyway, they put together a task force to address this. Okay, that makes sense, right? No problem there. A thing is happening. A government is going to come in and take a look at it. So unfortunately, all of their press releases already basically came to a conclusion. We're really the wildfire issue, and this has to be addressed head on. And what are they going to do? Are they going to have the beetles fight each other? No, of course, it's logging. That's their whole plan. And they've incorporated already timber production into the whole thing. Before they've even launched the task force, they already have their findings. But then they created the task force, and basically what I've been saying about this, it's a who's who of who's logging public lands in Colorado. It's every single entity, government, NGO that is either promoting or actively logging our public lands like we've never seen before. They're all on the task force. Almost, no, I will say no one that is an advocate for anything other than logging is there. We have a couple elected officials that we're not sure yet, but they haven't been super responsive. So what we did is we tried to set up meetings with some of the scientists and them. Like, we don't know why they weren't actively seeking out the scientists to be a part of it, but we were able to move this forward. It was a difficult process anyway. And then we set up a meeting with some conservationists and a couple of the folks who are in charge of this. Now, the head of the task force is somebody who is part of a forest health fire mitigation department here in Colorado. And she's actually married to a forester who logs public lands. I mean, it's the definition of conflict of interest. But just because you have a conflict of interest does not always mean that you're going to be biased. That's just a thing to be aware of. So we asked them, we said, hey, this is kind of unbalanced. You have actual members of the timber industry on the two representatives from timber industry groups. Like they're not even pretending to be otherwise. All these other folks who are logging public lands, huge. Would you be willing to balance the task force with some other folks, like some scientists, maybe one conservationist would be nice. Basically what they said is, no, we've already chosen all of them. And then we're like, well, that's okay. There's this other component to the task force, which is called the ex officio members. So for folks who don't know, that means non-voting members, so that they at least have advisory capacities. And on that, it's pretty much every politician in Colorado that is pushing the hardest for public lands logging. So we said, if you can't get people on the voting team, which we still believe that we can, because the governor can just expand the executive order to increase the number of people. It wouldn't be that hard. What about having just advisory members who are independent scientists and a member of the environmental conservation community, since you have the timber industry on there. Okay, let's get the other side on that. They're like, no, thanks. So my long-winded framing of this question is, how do you reach agencies that seem to have already made up their mind in advance and seem to have zero interest in any information that doesn't promote their pre-decided agenda?
You're doing everything you can. I mean, what you described is it's an impossible situation, and it's not new or unique. Uh, I mean, the grazing industry is a perfect example that is transcended for decades and actually over a century now of ways of undermining any kind of meaningful changes to uh, that that might countermand what is happening in terms of rangeland deterioration. And so, you're seeing the same thing in forested habitats. And it boils back to what we talked about earlier. If you control the media and you've got a populace that is somewhat disconnected from the environment that supports their livelihood, and most people are these days. I mean, it's very rare to meet people that spend or are ecologically aware. And so even within agencies, when I was a supervisor, I would, secretly term a lot of the biologists Discovery Channel biologists. I mean, they would come out of an urban area, and they're very well meaning, and they would go to take wildlife, uh, get their bachelor in wildlife management, and then do a grad program for a couple of years and spend several months out in the field. And then all of a sudden, they're in the office. They're writing reports. They're writing biological opinions. They're doing all of these things on a very limited scope of experience in the field. And they're susceptible to what I call ecological fads that, they sound good. Unless you're really adept and knowledgeable about ecological processes, it's easy to get taken in by these fads. And, I've seen it over and over my entire life. And all you can do is what you're doing, try to get the best information out that refutes the myths, and do what you can, because all you can do is what you can do. And, that's something that I've, struggled with on a personal level at different times in my career. But anybody that is really an environmental advocate and really cares about what's happening to ecosystems, that's one of the psychological things that you have to struggle with. And you can only do what you can do. And it sounds to me like you're doing what you can, and probably some of the people you're working with are doing what they can, but you can't override the avalanche of humanity that is bound and determined to have economic growth at all costs. And you can see that every day. And every election, we have all these grandiose hopes of, this administration will be better for the environment. But every politician is graded not by how well they treat the environment, but how well they manifest economic growth. And those two things are incompatible. And so, whether it's a Democratic administration or a Republican administration, I mean, the perception is they're different. The reality is ecological destruction is probably very well correlated with economic growth and GDP.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I appreciate your big picture take on this, because I do think that's the best way to really understand these forces. And yeah, I agree. There's only so much one can do, although, yeah, I'm always trying to strategize to do what I'm doing better. I guess a question I would have on this agency stuff is what weaknesses do they have? So what would be an Achilles heel of a land management, or I tend to call them because I'm snarky, a land mismanagement agency? What would be an Achilles heel there, or maybe for some of the not the individuals? I never target the individuals. It's the role there, the individual, the people themselves. That's not something that I concern myself with. But do you see what I'm saying? Is there any, what would be their weak point? Would it be negative PR? Would it be showing financial conflicts of interest? What do you think?
They don't have much in the way of weak point. Bureaucracy is so huge that it buffers almost anything that you can do. I mean, the people that I found in the environmental community, and there's only been a few, and this may sound weird, were in your face assholes. I mean, they would come into agencies and make managers uncomfortable. And in doing, I mean, that is the only way I've seen any any kind of even consideration of environmental effects. And there's a couple of NGO groups that had either have or had somebody like that in their leadership role. And they were the ones that I saw that, they didn't make a big difference, but they did make some kind of difference because reasonable people, I mean, agencies will eat up reasonable people. I mean, if you go in and you're reasonable, bureaucracies will just eat you up. And so, uh, you know, that's probably not, I, I mean, it's hard to be what you need to be to make a difference. And so, some people just don't have that kind of personality, but the personalities that I have seen that have, you know, made managers uncomfortable were those types of people.
Well, so are you giving me permission to continue to be an asshole then?
Yeah,
All right, you heard
absolutely.
it, folks. I got permission from Lyle to continue because, well, what I reframe it. Yes, I could be accused of being an asshole. I'm actually going to be writing a piece soon, and I do want to talk a little bit about your Substack before we wrap up, but about what I call yin versus yang advocacy. So yin yang, the principles of passivity, aggression. There's a lot of ways you can frame it. That's just a really simplistic view of that. And yin has its place. The soft approach, water can erode stone, all of that. Sometimes coming together, sometimes realizing when a fight can't be won. All of that has its importance. But yang advocacy is that more in your face, what some call sometimes toxic and maybe sometimes can be. But I have found that, yes, the only thing that they listen to is somebody being a little uppity. And of course, they try to then demonize. So it's very easy then, if somebody is the least bit ill-mannered, to be like, we don't talk to that person because he's like this. So I try to really maintain as much calm as possible, everything like that. But I do push the envelope a little bit. And yes, I find it makes them very uncomfortable. They absolutely despise and detest that, which I can only assume is because, like you're saying, it is uncomfortable for them. They would much rather have somebody come in who I'm always cordial and professional, but I do ask the difficult things. And yes, publicly, if they put you off enough and they're making false statements, I will say that. But I do see the role for others who are a little bit more soft spoken. So I can be that lightning rod, and then others can step in. It's like, which would you rather deal with? Do you rather deal with me or rather deal with them? And usually they would not rather deal with me. So that's really interesting that you would bring that up, not because I'm looking for justification for my personality disorder or whatever is wrong with me, but because sometimes that is important to be able to push buttons a little bit, be accurate, be professional, but I'm glad to hear that you also believe that there's a place for that, and that sometimes maybe the agencies will maybe just agree because they don't want to have to just deal with that discomfort. So that's interesting that you would say
Well,
that.
and it's kind of the same thing and the recent piece I wrote in on Substack about the agencies kind of mirroring ecosystems. Ecosystems have always had a variability to them. I mean, that's what makes them function. And we try to smooth out that variability and simplify everything. But agencies do the same thing, and that they want to go, they want things to go smoothly. They don't want anybody to cause any conflict. They want everything to go just super smooth. And as a result, they don't ask hard questions because that can result in the variability in what, the going smooth framework that they're set up to foster. And so, whether it's someone on the inside or someone on the outside that asks difficult questions and puts people in awkward positions, those are the things that agency tries to stifle. And so, that's what you're faced with. But it still boils down to, some people don't have the personality for that. And what your analogy on yin and yang is very appropriate in that, some people can be extremely effective in whatever role that they choose. And I'm not saying there's one right way or one wrong way. There are all kinds of ways to be effective in creating friction and trying to hang on to what we've got. But that's all we can do is, do what we can, create friction where we can, and accept that, without some major civilizational changes and human changes, we're going to lose, and we are losing.
Yeah, no, I agree with all that. Unfortunately, I agree with the fact that we are losing. And yeah, I want to be putting more and more of my efforts into elevating the voices of others. I'm going to say the things that others are not saying just because of my personality, but realizing other people have different personalities. There's a fellow up here, he's a backcountry deer and elk hunter, and he actually contacted me because he appreciated my work I was doing on all the clear cutting in the name of quote wildfire mitigation. And he took me out and he showed me clear cuts I'd never seen and how it's impacting his hunting. I'm personally not a hunter, but that's his use of the land there. He's not a trophy hunter. He hunts for food. And he said it's the deer and elk that used to come around don't come around no more. And he's got a great voice, but he himself is not the type to put himself out there. So I said, can I videotape you? And so I did. And we're going to put out a short little film entirely with his perspective. I don't editorialize any of it, just his voice. So maybe, yes, my yang can help elevate other people's yin. And yeah, every perspective, anytime anyone talks to me and they have basically a 10% overlap, I'm like, how can I help you get your voice out there? We need all these other voices. And yes, I'll come in and be the bad cop, if I have to. It's not something I enjoy, but if I can do it, I'll do it. But anyway, I want to just take the last few minutes to talk a little bit about your Substack, which is, I mean, you're an incredible writer, and you have a philosophical view almost. Your writing reminds me of a guy whose name I can't remember, which is not at all helpful to this discussion whatsoever. But damn, maybe I will edit that name in. He wrote a lot of essays about environmental things, but from this almost evolutionary perspective where he pulls back and really looks at all the time frames. I almost had it, but anyway, whoever he is, you're similar to him. And let me just read the blurb that's under your Substack, which is, so this is substack.com at Lyle Lewis, Lylelewis. I'm going to put that in the links and everything, the description. But You refer to yourself an ecologist and writer exploring deep time, human behavior, and the sixth mass extinction. Essays cut through comforting myths to show how plastics, climate, biodiversity loss, and other crises intertwine. So tell us a little more about what you're doing on your Substack.
Well, actually, I'm writing a book, and so I'm Substack is just kind of a sideline more than anything else, and it's a few of the concepts on Substack. I'm incorporating into my book, not not the article itself, but just some of the concepts. But I'm just trying to make people better aware of that we're really in a mass extinction. We're a long, long ways down the road. And this isn't something that, that we inherited a planet that had been modified, often in most cases twice. Ecosystems had completely disappeared, and then they have disappeared again, and now they're disappearing one final time. And so recognizing that that has happened and that what we're dealing with, I mean, we aren't the start of a mass extinction event, but we are probably going to see the end of it. And that is sobering in a lot of ways, but it also puts everything in perspective. And, you know, it, and it really isn't, it's just this long continuum of, when we dropped out of the trees and developed our shoulder girdle and then uh, mastered fire. And then it was our ability to socially connect with other human beings in a larger and larger way, and then agriculture, and then civilizations, and then industrialization. It's just this really long, gradual arc that we're under that was inspired by evolution. And there's been five other mass extinction events. None of them were set in motion by a biological organism. All of them were set in motion by usually by some kind of a geological event or a single cellular organism in the case of cyanobacteria. So, you know, I spend some time on social media, and anytime that I do a post on an endangered species that or an extinct species, I always get this pushback from somebody that says, 99.9% of all species have gone extinct. And, they're right. 99.9% of all species have gone extinct. And we didn't get an exemption. We're a species. And people sometimes forget that. And every species has a shelf life. And, every species has a shelf life. That's all I'm going to say. And we're cruising toward the end of, I think, what our shelf life is.
Yeah, I can't disagree again. I guess the difference is that we're watching it happen and we have the knowledge to witness our impending doom. And that is pretty damn awful because it seems as if the other species did not, they were at least kept from that conscious knowledge, I would assume. But we're watching it happen and it's pretty excruciating. And yeah, there's people like me who are trying to stick their finger to plug these dike just because I don't know what else to do, right? I guess the other option is I can become a hedonist and just be like, yeah, it's all falling apart. But these are the philosophical underpinnings of this. And that's what's really great about your writing. And I found the name of the guy I couldn't figure out. Lauren Isley. Are you familiar with Lauren Isley?
No, I guess not.
Oh, okay. So yeah, American anthropologist, educator, philosopher, natural science writer. He was 1907 to 1977. He has these beautiful books, these essays on it's environmental, but it's more in the anthropology and evolution field, and it's just lyrical and philosophical. And yeah, if you haven't checked out Lauren Isley, you might appreciate him, because I that's what your work reminds me of. But yeah, I appreciate all the stuff that you're saying, the deep take on all of these issues, which I think about a lot too, which I don't always find that I can translate into my advocacy. But a lot of the advocacy is fairly surface level. But you give me pause, you make me maybe think that I should be taking more of these things in perspective, if only to preserve my sanity. And a lot of folks in the activist advocacy movement, we're having some hard times, and it's not just because of our personality. It's because of what we're watching in the world, and we're trying to be a part of something, knowing we might be on a losing team, but we still have to do what we feel like we can, but we probably shouldn't throw ourselves under the bus doing it. It's a tricky thing. But so for the final segment of this, I like to ask my guests a question, which is the heart of the podcast, which is Green Root Podcast. So the root. So what would you say is at least a root? And you've kind of answered this already, but maybe you can just reiterate. What would you say is a root of the ecological crisis, or the root, if you've got that figured out?
It's evolution. I mean, there isn't, you can blame capitalism, you can blame industrialization, but we're a species that was able to push back the ecosystem constraints that normally would provide immediate feedback. In other words, at some point in time, there were predators that kept us in check, or there was uh, the amount of food that kept us in check, or the amount of water that kept us in check, all those things. But we were able to engineer our way out of those constraints, those immediate feedbacks. And as a result of engineering our way out of the immediate feedback loop, we became further and further removed from feedbacks. And becoming further removed pushed those feedbacks further and further into the future. And so what we've done is liquidate resources that can never be replaced. We can't put the nutrients back on the landscape that livestock grazing has taken off. We can't put nutrients on the landscape that loggers have taken off. All we can do, we're left with what we've got. And and so accepting that, and there's only a few of us that are able to actually accept what is happening for a whole variety of reasons. And we just barely touched on it. You could have a huge podcast just on the behavioral aspect of denial and willful blindness, and all of the other things that we're seeing, this that people are able to ignore what's happening all around them. And uh, and so we've just removed ourselves from those environmental constraints to the point that uh, we've liquidated the future and are continuing to, and the bills are coming due. And whether it's you see with climate change is the most obvious to a lot of people, but chemical toxins in the environment, the loss of biodiversity, invasive species, infectious disease, and none of those work in a vacuum. I mean, they all amplify each other, and but we have the ability to ignore that for a whole variety of behavioral ways. And evolutionarily, we're just kind of a strange critter, and uh, and the Earth has never produced another bipedal throwing super predator. And so, you can blame it on all kinds of different things, but I'm not sure there is blame. We just are who we are.
Well, thank you so much for that. Thank you for your eloquence, and thank you for your time. And all your great writing. Looking forward to that book. When's that book coming out?
Well, I'm still in the formative stages, so I've got a structural draft put together, but it's still, I'll probably look for a publisher down the road, and so it's still a ways away. But
Well, I'm looking forward to that.
I,
Uh,
I hope
I,
you'll enjoy it.
I'm sure I will. In the meantime, folks should check out Lyle Lewis's Substack. Again, all that link is in the description. And thank you so much, Lyle, for coming on the Green Root podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me.